And also, it was this, this total.
The chapel was quiet. Robert Downey Jr. stood alone beside a simple wooden casket, his tailored suit damp from the morning mist. His eyes, so familiar to millions as Iron Man, were hollow now, fixed on a framed black-and-white photo resting on top of the flowers. It was his father, his first director, his first corrupter, and perhaps his greatest pain. Few knew what this moment truly meant. Before the Marvel fame, before the box office billions, Robert was a boy raised inside the chaos of underground cinema and substance-laced nights. His father, Robert Downey Sr., had once handed him a joint when he was just 6 years old. His mother, Elsie, a gentle actress, drifted in and out of his life like a fading spotlight. The world sees a comeback story, a redemption arc wrapped in red and gold armor. But behind the legend is a son still wrestling with a past shaped by brilliance, neglect, and a complicated love. This is not just the story of Robert Downey Jr. This is the story of what happened to the people who made him.
Born on April 4, 1965, in Manhattan, New York City, Robert John Downey Jr. entered the world not in a delivery room of peace and quiet, but into the unpredictable orbit of a bohemian, chaotic, and fiercely creative family. His father, Robert Downey Sr., was an underground filmmaker known for surreal, politically charged films. His mother, Elsie Ann Ford, was an actress who appeared in many of her husband's productions. Art was not a calling in their home, it was a condition of existence. Robert made his acting debut at the age of 5, appearing in his father's absurdist film Pound, 1970. It was not just a cameo, it was a foreshadowing. As the years unfolded, Robert grew up on film sets more often than schoolyards, memorizing lines instead of math, watching his parents pour themselves into their art, and sometimes into addiction. By his 20s, Robert had become a rising star in Hollywood. With films like Less Than Zero, Chaplin, and Natural Born Killers, he showed uncanny range, charisma, and intensity. His performance in Chaplin, 1992, earned him an Academy Award nomination, solidifying his place among the most gifted actors of his generation. But talent was never his problem. Control was. As his fame grew, so did his dependency on drugs, some of which had been introduced to him by his father, in what would later be described as a tragically permissive household. Between 1996 and 2001, he was arrested multiple times on charges related to cocaine, heroin, and marijuana. He spent months in prison and rehab facilities while his public image spiraled into scandal. For a while, Robert Downey Jr. was Hollywood's cautionary tale, a wasted genius, undone by demons too deep to name. And then came the impossible second act. In 2008, he donned the iron suit that would change everything. Iron Man wasn't just a blockbuster, it was Robert's resurrection. Over the next decade, he became the beating heart of the Marvel Cinematic Universe, portraying Tony Stark, a flawed genius with a troubled past, in a performance that mirrored his own life more than most fans realized. He didn't just rebuild his career, he rebuilt himself. But success never fully silenced the echo of his childhood. Behind the scenes, Robert continued to grapple with his past, with parents who had loved him, but not always rightly, with a childhood that gave him art, but stole his innocence, with the ghosts of two people who shaped every frame of his life, for better and worse. Because to understand Robert Downey Jr., you have to look beyond the armor. You have to go home.
Before the legend of Iron Man, there was the legend of a man behind the camera, Robert Downey Sr., a rebel filmmaker with a cigarette always between his fingers and an idea always burning through his mind. Born in New York City in 1936, he came of age during a time when American cinema was being reshaped by counterculture and protest. But Robert Sr. wasn't just reacting to the world, he was redefining it in his own eccentric, uncompromising way. He made films that confused Hollywood and fascinated critics. Putney Swope, 1969, his most famous work, was a satirical punch in the face to corporate America and racism, filmed in black and white with jarring voiceovers and surrealist cuts. It wasn't polished, it wasn't safe, it was Downey Sr. But while his films were cult masterpieces, his home life was a blur of smoke, jazz, camera reels, and eventually chaos. Robert Jr. didn't grow up in a traditional home. He grew up in an open loft that smelled like paint thinner and dreams, where lines were rehearsed in one corner while joints were rolled in another. Downey Sr. loved his son, but he was not equipped to raise one. He treated little Robert like a peer, not a child. He took him to late-night screenings, exposed him to adult conversations, and worst of all, introduced him to drugs. In a raw emotional interview years later, Robert Jr. revealed that his father once gave him marijuana when he was just 6. At first it was painted as a bonding moment, father and son sharing something creative. But the consequences would unfold across decades. Downey Sr. would later admit regret. He once told Vanity Fair, "It was the stupidest thing I've ever done." He acknowledged that he had enabled his son's addiction without understanding its weight. But at the time, their relationship was more like two artists chasing the same high through cinema, substances, or rebellion. They weren't just father and son. They were co-conspirators in a lifestyle that didn't have boundaries. And yet, love was always there. Deep down, under the haze, Robert Sr. adored his son. He believed in his talent, cast him in his early films, and defended him fiercely even when the world turned its back. But he didn't know how to be a father, not in the way a child needs. His love was tangled in his own unresolved traumas, his own addictions, and his lifelong insistence on doing things his way. There were moments, brief, fleeting moments, when Robert Jr. caught glimpses of the man behind the icon. They would sit on the floor with old jazz records or ride subways just to watch people. Robert Sr. taught his son to observe, to listen, to feel. And those lessons, the quiet ones, stayed. When Robert Jr. was at his lowest, in and out of jail and rehab, his father stayed close, but often silent. He didn't stage interventions. He didn't cry on TV. He waited, watching his son disappear, hoping one day he'd find the light again. And when he did, when Robert Jr. walked onto the red carpet as Iron Man, clean, married, and victorious, Robert Sr. was there, silent again, but this time with pride in his eyes. In the final years of his life, Parkinson's disease robbed Downey Sr. of his agility, his speech, and eventually, his presence. But it didn't erase the complex tapestry he had woven into his son's life. At his core, he was a man who tried, imperfectly, often painfully, to raise a boy in a world too fast, too wild, and too unforgiving. Robert Jr. once said, "My dad always made me feel like I was capable of anything, even if the world thought otherwise." That paradox, that mixture of permission and pain, was the gift and the curse of being the son of Robert Downey Sr. Because sometimes love doesn't come wrapped in safety. Sometimes it comes wrapped in fire. It began with a tremble. At first, Robert Downey Sr. brushed it off, a slight shaking in his hand, an occasional stumble on stairs. He had lived a wild, unstructured life. A few jitters, nothing new. But in the quiet of his Brooklyn apartment, far from the lights of his earlier film sets, something deeper was unraveling. The tremors worsened. His speech slowed, his gaze grew distant. It was Parkinson's disease. A thief of time and dignity, the illness crept through his body with cruel patience. For a man who had once filled screens with movement, music, madness, it was a brutal irony. The director who had guided chaos now found himself slowly losing control of the simplest gestures. Robert Jr. knew what was happening, and this time, unlike the early years of silence and shadows, he did not look away. He stepped in, quietly, lovingly. In interviews, he never dramatized it. There were no long public statements. But behind the scenes, he became his father's caretaker, managing medical care, visiting regularly, making sure the final years were not endured in isolation. Those years were quiet. No more film reels, no more camera rigs, just the slow fade of a man who had once lived so loud. On July 7, 2021, at age 85, Robert Downey Sr. passed away in his sleep at his home in New York City. The statement from the family was short and gentle. He died peacefully after battling Parkinson's disease for over 5 years. But for Robert Jr., it was not a peaceful night. The man who had both launched him and nearly lost him, who had handed him both his first film role and his first addiction, was gone. There would be no more apologies, no more chances for clarity, just memories, tangled and raw, like unedited film on a cutting room floor. His death came less than a decade after the loss of Robert Jr.'s mother, Elsie. She had passed in 2014 after her own private battle with age and illness. Unlike her husband, she had never made headlines. Her death was a quiet ripple in Hollywood. But for Robert, it marked the end of something sacred. He had once said that when his mother died, he felt like the last tether to his childhood had been cut. And now, with his father's passing, the entire stage of his upbringing, brilliant, broken, blazing, had gone dark. The world mourned Robert Sr. as a pioneer of experimental film, but his son mourned something else. A man who had tried, failed, tried again, and in doing so, left behind not just a legacy of cinema, but the blueprint of a survival story. That night, Robert Jr. posted a photo of his father, captioned simply, "R.I.P. Bob D. Sr., 1936-2021, a true maverick." No bitterness, no blame, just love. Hard-earned and hard-kept. Because sometimes death doesn't close a chapter. It finally explains it.
The sky over New York was overcast on the morning of July 10, 2021. It didn't rain, but the air felt heavy, as if the city itself understood it was about to say goodbye to one of its most unruly sons. Robert Downey Jr. arrived at the private funeral in a dark navy suit, no entourage, no security detail, just a quiet man carrying a lifetime of unresolved love. The service was held in a modest chapel in Manhattan, not far from where Robert Sr. had once filmed Putney Swope. There were no elaborate floral arches or grand eulogies. That would have gone against everything the elder Downey believed in. He had lived on the fringe. He would leave on his own terms. Inside the chapel, the mood was hushed. A handful of people attended, independent filmmakers, old friends from the 1970s downtown art scene, a few extended family members, and Robert Jr.'s wife, Susan. There was no media, no cameras, no Marvel stars, no Hollywood spectacle. Just people who remembered the man not for his son, but for his strange, brilliant mind. At the front of the room was a closed casket. On it sat a framed photo of Robert Downey Sr. in his youth,
sunglasses on, head tilted, the grin of a man who always saw the world at a slant. Next to it was a vintage film camera, one he had used on dozens of his experimental shoots. A quiet tribute to a life lived in frames. Robert Jr. sat in the front row, shoulders slightly hunched, hands clasped together. For a long time he didn't speak. Not during the opening remarks, not during the reading of passages. It was only when the room fell completely still that he rose. He didn't pull out notes. He didn't clear his throat. I used to wonder if my father ever really saw me, not just through a camera or in the lines of a script, but truly as his son. Today, I think I finally have my answer. His voice wavered, just slightly. He was a hurricane of a man, a genius, a madman, a terrible parent at times. But he taught me how to create, how to survive, and maybe how to forgive. There was no applause, just silence, the kind of silence that wraps itself around you like a blanket, equal parts comfort and weight. After the service, Robert Jr. approached the casket alone. He placed a folded piece of paper on top, a letter, no one knows what it said, and a worn VHS tape, Pound, 1970, the film where he first appeared as a child. A full-circled moment, from the screen to the silence. Outside the chapel, a small group had gathered, fans, film students, curious strangers. No one screamed, no one asked for autographs. They just stood respectfully as Robert exited. One woman, older, perhaps a longtime admirer of Downey Sr.'s work, whispered, "That man was a genius." Robert turned his head slightly, nodded, and walked into the waiting car. As it pulled away, the clouds above Manhattan finally broke. A thin ray of sunlight sliced through the gray. It touched the roof of the chapel, warm and fleeting. And just like that, the curtain closed on Robert Downey Sr. But his story, the chaos, the brilliance, the love that couldn't always speak its name, was far from over. Because it lived on, in the man who had learned how to stand, even after being raised in the storm.
After the funeral, Robert Downey Jr. didn't return to red carpets or magazine covers. For weeks, he stayed quiet. No press releases, no emotional interviews, just a few subtle changes that only those closest to him noticed. He stopped taking certain meetings. He canceled 2 appearances. He spent more time at home with his wife Susan and their children. Because something had shifted. The death of his father, following years of distance, reconciliation, and finally fragility, had closed the last open wound of his youth. He was no longer just the comeback king of Hollywood. He was now the keeper of a legacy, a complicated, flawed, brilliant legacy that had both damaged and defined him. In private conversations, he reportedly referred to those final weeks with his father as a quiet kind of miracle. Not because they were perfect, but because they were real. They had sat together, watched old movies, laughed at memories that once brought pain. There were no dramatic final words, no teary-eyed cinematic closure, just presence. For the first time maybe ever, Robert Jr. and his father had simply existed, without trying to fix what couldn't be fixed. Professionally, something else began to take root. Post-Iron Man, Downey shifted away from large franchise roles and began producing more human-scale stories, intimate dramas, docuseries, even a show about environmental restoration. It was as if letting go of his past had freed him to turn outward, to help reshape the world that had once broken him. And at home, he became the father he never had, strict about boundaries, present at every recital, every sports game. No substances in the house. Open conversations about pain, fear, and resilience. He often said,
My greatest role is an Iron Man. It's Dad. In an Instagram post on what would have been his father's 87th birthday, he wrote, "You were wild. You were brilliant. You were wrong about a lot. But you were right about one thing. The best stories are the ones we survive." Robert Downey Jr. survived. And now, with the storm behind him, he walks forward, not as a son looking back in anger, but as a man carrying both light and shadow, determined to break the cycle, to do it better, to turn inherited pain into something stronger, into love.
Some stories aren't written in ink, but in silence, in the things left unsaid between fathers and sons, in the glances that carried both pride and guilt. Robert Downey Jr. didn't just grow up in the shadow of a man like Robert Downey Sr., he was forged in it. He learned early that love could be chaotic, that brilliance and damage could coexist in the same person, and that sometimes healing isn't loud or dramatic. Sometimes it's quiet. A hand held near the end, a memory shared over old film reels, a whisper of forgiveness long overdue. For Robert, the spotlight no longer hides the pain, it honors it. Every performance, every quiet moment with his children, every decision to live clean and honest is a conversation with the ghosts who raised him. Because in the end, we are all shaped by those who came before us. Not perfectly, not easily, but undeniably. And you, have you ever looked at your parents, not as heroes or villains, but as flawed human beings, trying their best? Maybe it's time. Leave your thoughts in the comments. And if stories like these touch you, the stories behind the fame, the truths of life, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel to know more stories behind the stars.